made with spoken. Fulfillment of the Law, a Havoc in Wyoming Short Story, by Millie Copper. Digital narration, performed by Andrew. The semi rolled past slow. Like Bart Ferguson wanted every soul left in Nemont to get a good look at what he and his boy had built. Harlan stood at his picture window, coffee mug warm in both hands, and watched. It was something, he had to admit, something that looked like it could be in an end-of-the-world movie. They'd armored the front of the rig with heavy steel plate, welded into a brush guard that could push a house off its foundation. The flatbed trailer behind carried ATVs and dirt bikes, fuel cans lashed down tight with orange straps. "Smart," Harlan said to the empty room. The truck disappeared around the bend and the road went quiet again. Quieter than it had any right to be for a Thursday morning. No school buses, no commuters, nobody heading into Alto for groceries. Just a breeze moving through the Doug firs and, somewhere behind the houses across the street, a crow making a fuss about something it didn't like. 2 days ago, Harlan had walked over to the machine shop owned by Bart and his son Ben, with no particular reason except restlessness and the need to be around somebody doing something purposeful. Bart was in the bay, supervising the welding on that brush guard, and they'd talked for a while. It was plain that the Fergusons were getting ready to leave. The thought had formed itself in Harlan's mouth, the idea of asking if he could come along, and then he'd swallowed it back down. There was no sense in that. Leaving wasn't in the cards for him. He had his reasons, and they were good ones, and that was the end of it. His gaze drifted from the empty road to the house across the street. A few of the neighborhood men were clustered near the driveway, talking in the low, purposeful way men talk when they believe they are in charge of something. Harlan recognized all of them. The tallest one he recognized differently than the rest. Rick Burdock stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, gun on his hip, watching the direction the semi had gone with something like satisfaction on his face. Harlan looked at him for a long moment before turning away from the window. He understood what had to be done. He set his coffee mug in the sink, rinsed it, placed it in the drying rack the way Betsy had always insisted on. Old habit. The dish towel went back on the oven handle, straight, the way she liked it. Small things. They still mattered, or at least doing them still felt like it mattered, which was close enough. What would Betsy think of this? She would have insisted on gathering the group for prayers that first night the planes went down. No matter, it was the time many of them should have been getting ready for bed, she would have activated the phone tree and opened their house. That's just who she was. Betsy loved the Lord and believed in the power of prayer. Getting her prayer warriors together was a regular occurrence. Harlan usually made himself scarce when they showed up, not because he believed differently than Betsy, but because praying out loud in a group was often uncomfortable for him. That had changed, but by then it was too late for Betsy to take notice. He'd been puttering around the house, television on in the background, when the news had broken about the plane crashes. At first he thought it was coincident, but any thinking person soon realized 5 planes didn't crash minutes apart without the incidents being related. His suspicion was confirmed when bombs were detonated at each crash-affected airport as the first responders began to arrive. That was only a week ago. Things had changed more than he could have ever imagined during that time. The day after the plane crashes and airport explosions, bridges across the country were targeted. Several in nearby Portland were destroyed. The result of that was something out of a nightmare as people fled their homes, heading for places that were somehow, at least in their minds, deemed safe. Harlan squeezed his eyes shut as he remembered the woman with the bright green eyes, holding her young child, as she spoke of how the windows of her house had rattled when someone had taken out the Selwood Bridge. The mass amounts of people heading for the ocean and the cyber attack on Saturday made getting fuel impossible, forcing them to stop. She and her child were the reason this was necessary. One of the reasons anyway, but the one that made it hard for him to sleep and even breathe sometimes. He snorted out a laugh which turned into a cough. Breathing had been hard for months, but in a different way. He quickly pulled his hanky out of his pocket and put it to his mouth. After the coughing ended, he whispered, "The memory of that youngster isn't the only reason you can't breathe, you old fool." Harlan went back to the job he'd been working on before he'd heard the semi-truck come rattling through the neighborhood. There was no rushing about it. A man with nothing to lose moves differently than other men. unhurried, deliberate, and unbothered by the future because they had already explained it to him in a small beige office with a motivational poster on the wall. Since the doctors had laid it all out, Harlan had noticed the change in himself. Slower, more careful. With his camouflage backpack stocked with the items he thought he'd need, he moved to the bedroom. The closet shelf held the rifle case where it always had. He lifted it down and set it on the bed, on Betsy's side, and unzipped it. The rifle was clean. He kept it clean out of habit, and something close to respect for the thing, but he checked it over anyway. Ammunition went on the bedspread next to the case. He moved back to the closet and pulled out the rack that held a variety of belts. He looked for the one he used specifically for hunting. Not an actual belt, but a bandolier that held 50 of the .308 cartridges his rifle took. Not that he'd need 50. One would do it. The note he'd written the night before sat on the kitchen counter. He left it where it was. Jacket on, backpack over one shoulder, rifle in hand. Harlan stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the room. 30 years he and Betsy had lived in this house, and before that, the two of them in a rented place in Alto, while they saved enough to buy land and build. They'd moved into this house when the subdivision was still a forest, long before old Hendricks sold off his back 40. They'd watched as the forest was replaced with dirt roads and survey stakes, then paved roads and houses. The developers carved everything up into tidy lots with 3-car garages and landscaped yards. Betsy had loved it anyway. She loved the Douglas firs that covered their 5 acres, the little creek along the back of the property where they often sat in the evenings, the space she had for a garden. She grew roses mostly, and some vegetables she never fully committed to, and she'd stand out there in the mornings in her robe with her coffee, just looking at things. Not working, just looking. Cancer had killed her 3 years ago, the week before Thanksgiving. The doctors gave her 8 months, and she'd made 11, which was Betsy all the way through. She never did anything quite the way you expected. The Big C was doing its work on Harlan, too, though it had a different origin. They didn't dwell on how he got it, just used a lot of careful language about stages and options and quality of life. He'd listened politely and driven home and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The thing was, if he was being honest with himself, it wasn't the worst news he'd ever received. The worst news was Betsy. This was just the rest of the story catching up. He stepped out the back door and onto the porch. He'd already decided to leave the house unlocked. The woods at the back of his property were second growth, dense with fern and swordgrass between the trees. Wet ground. He picked his footing carefully, moving slowly, his breath coming a little harder than it should for flat ground. Once he had to stop and press his lips together against the cough building in his chest, breathe through his nose until it passed. At the property line, he crossed into the Freemeyers' place. Tom and Linda. The house sat with its curtains drawn. Good neighbors for 20-some years. Tom had a daughter in Bend he'd been talking about going to visit, back when visiting people was still something a person could just decide to do. He hoped they'd done just that. Got away before traveling became too difficult and gas too scarce. He didn't think so, though. Harlan didn't know for certain what had become of them, but he had his suspicions. Several families on this end of town had simply gone quiet over the past week, stopped generating the ordinary signs of daily life, no movement behind windows, no light after dark, nothing. A particular kind of stillness. Not the stillness of people keeping to themselves, but the stillness of absence. He'd known what Rick Burdock was for a long time, the way you come to know certain things about certain men without being able to point to a single piece of evidence. The poaching arrest was years back, and was almost beside the point. It was the way Burdock moved through the community that told the actual story, always taking inventory, always finding angles, always knowing who had what, and what it might be worth to him. Something predatory in the man that had nothing to do with deer or elk killed out of season. Harlan had kept his distance, kept his opinions to himself. When there were still consequences in the world, a person did that. There were no consequences now. That was the thing that had changed. Crossing through the Freemeyers' yard and into the next property, Harlan thought about the refugees down by the creek. He'd known they were there for a full day before he did anything about it. He'd stood at the front window and watched the thin column of smoke rising from their camp, and argued with himself about what exactly he thought he was going to do. March down there with a casserole? He didn't even know how many there were. But he'd gone. His neighbor Dave had come with him, the two of them loading up what they could carry: blankets, canned goods, jugs of fresh water, granola bars. Not enough. It would never be enough. But the woman who'd come out to meet them, heavy-set and gray-haired, her eyes red from smoke or crying or both, had taken Harlan's hand in both of hers and held it, and thanked him in a way that settled somewhere in his chest and stayed. That's when he'd spoken to the woman with the green eyes and the young child on her hip. In many ways, she reminded him of Betsy, though she looked nothing like his wife and they'd had no children. Still, there was something about the woman that made an impression on him. Dave had disappeared later that day, and then the next morning, before light, Harlan had lain in his bed and listened to the gunfire. He'd counted shots the way you count seconds between lightning and thunder, measuring distance, duration, meaning. It went on too long to be anything good. When it finally stopped, he got up and made coffee and sat at the table while the sky went pale outside, and he understood what had happened before anyone came to tell him. Some things you simply know. Later that morning, he'd walked to the road and stood there watching Burdock run his backhoe, digging a trench for a mass grave. Harlan watched until he'd seen enough. He'd written the note that night. Harlan had 2 more properties to slip past, hugging the tree line and sticking to the yard edges. He and Betsy used to take long walks through the neighborhood back when the town was small and dirt roads bordered wide stretches of land. He knew where the ground rose and fell, which lots still held their old growth, and which people had cleared bare. Folks were used to seeing him out walking around town. After he retired from the paper mill, 2 years before Betsy died, he started walking more than driving. The weekly run to Alto for groceries was about the only time he took the car. Now he always added a visit to Betsy's grave on his grocery run days. But when he was near home, it felt like a waste not to stretch his legs. And after retiring, he felt little need to hurry anymore. It wasn't much further until he'd get to where he needed to be. He was heading for the rise on the north end, where the older properties backed against a low ridge. He'd identified the spot in his mind the morning he'd seen Burdock digging the trench, without quite letting himself acknowledge what he had planned. From up there, the elevation was enough. Clean line of sight down into the newer development where Burdock's house sat, third from the end, gray siding and a black truck in the driveway. Behind the old Mercer place, he stopped in the tree line and coughed into his handkerchief. It lasted longer than he'd have liked. When it was done, he straightened up, checked the handkerchief without wanting to, noticed the blood smears, folded it, and put it away. Then he kept moving. The ridge was modest, 30 feet of elevation over a long, gentle slope, but 30 feet was enough. He'd hunted enough to understand what enough meant. Coming up through the trees on the backside, he found the spot just as he'd pictured it, a flat shelf of ground carpeted in old needles, sheltered on 3 sides by firs. He set the backpack down and lowered himself first to his knees, then onto his stomach, his body settling into the old discipline of it. Frosty mornings and elk season for nearly 50 years had worn the position into his muscle memory. His joints expressed their opinions. He didn't need to entertain them. The backpack went under the rifle as a rest. Through the scope, the newer houses sat on their tidy lots below. Burdock's place was perfectly in view. Now there was nothing to do but wait. A squirrel worked along a branch somewhere overhead. The breeze moved the tops of the firs. Patience was something Harlan had always had, more than was useful in some situations and less charming than people assumed. Betsy had called it his best quality and his most aggravating one, depending on what she needed from him at the time. He settled into it now the way he'd always settled into a blind or a stand, letting the waiting become its own kind of presence. His thoughts drifted to Betsy, the way they always did when things went quiet. The evening light on her hair when she sat by the creek, her actual laugh, the uncontrollable one, was distinct from the polite one she reserved for strangers. The way she'd looked standing among the roses in her robe, coffee in hand, not working, just looking. He thought he understood that better now than he had then. The front door opened. Burdock came out with no particular hurry, a bottle of something in hand, and stood on the porch the way a man stands when he believes he owns everything in his line of sight. Same jacket as earlier, gun on his hip. He looked up and down the street, took a drink from the bottle, and said something back through the open door. Another man from the neighborhood came out and stood beside him. Something happened in Harlan's chest. A slowing, a settling, some deep mechanical thing that had always happened when the moment arrived and everything else went still. His breathing evened out. His heartbeat dropped. He found his position and made his adjustments without thinking about them, his hands doing what they knew to do. He thought about the woman with the green eyes and the baby on her hip. About his friend Dave, who'd disappeared after they'd taken food to the refugees. Tom and Linda Freemeyer, and the particular stillness behind their curtained windows, and the other families who'd mysteriously gone missing. The shot broke open the morning. The echo rolled out through the trees, came back smaller, and was gone. Down on the porch, the second man dropped his bottle and scrambled through the door. Burdock was down. Harlan didn't look through the scope again. All those years of hunting, and he'd rarely needed a second shot. He lay still for a moment, not from fear, but from some instinct that said wait. So he waited, watching Burdock where he lay half sprawled on the porch and half on the walkway. Nothing moved in the neighborhood below except a curtain in one of the houses, twitching once and going still. He rolled to the side, keeping the rifle close and grabbing the backpack as he went. Once he was below the ridgeline and out of sight, he made his way to his knees. His movements were slower than he would have liked, but eventually he was on his feet. The backpack went over his shoulder, the rifle in his hand, and he walked back down the slope through the trees the way he'd come, stepping over the same wet roots, pushing through the same sword ferns. His urge was to run, but he knew there was no reason. If they came after him, he didn't have it in him to outrun them, and hiding wasn't an option. He had expected to feel something specific. He'd thought there might be some sense of reckoning, of accounts settling, some correspondence between the act and the beliefs he'd carried for 62 years about right and wrong and what a person was capable of justifying. He'd thought about it enough since he'd seen Burdock digging the trench that he'd half convinced himself he knew what it would feel like. Walking back through the Freemeyers' yard, he didn't look at their house. He crossed into his own woods, came through the ferns into the backyard, and stopped at the creek. The water was running. The pair of heavy wooden lawn chairs still sat where they had for years. He'd made the chairs from a pattern Betsy had found in a magazine. Evenings by the creek had been their version of a date. He stood and looked at them for a while, at the water moving past it, at the firs on the other side of the creek. With a sigh, he finished the walk to his house, slipping inside the back door. The rifle went on the kitchen table. Cleaning it was a methodical process, and he gave it the time it required, running patches through until they came out clean, working oil into the metal with the cloth he'd used for years, checking the action twice. When it was done, he zipped the case shut, carried it to the bedroom, and put it back on the closet shelf where it lived. At the kitchen sink, he washed his hands. Through the window, the backyard held a gray light, the sky having clouded over since he'd came back inside. A typical Oregon day. The dish towel went back on the oven handle, straight. He sat down at the table. Not tired, not hungry, not anything he had a clean name for. From somewhere in the neighborhood came voices, urgent and overlapping, and then the sound of running feet on pavement. He sat and listened until the voices moved off, and things went quiet again. Harlan told himself this was about keeping people safe. He still believed it, more or less. Rick Burdock had killed people. Not because of some noble reason, but because he could. Without anyone to stop him, he would have kept doing it. The families on this street would have kept going quiet, one by one, until there was no one left who remembered what the neighborhood had been. Harlan had put a stop to that. That was a true thing, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But true and simple weren't the same thing. He'd known that before, in the way you know things you haven't yet had to carry. Now the knowing had weight to it. He'd carry it differently from here on, through whatever here on turned out to be. The doctors had said late summer, probably. Definitely before winter. The note was still on the counter where he'd left it. He got up and crossed the kitchen and picked it up. His own handwriting looked back at him, a little shakier than it used to be, which still bothered him when he let himself think about it. He read the words he'd written. I did what I had to do to keep people safe. Then he folded it again, and kept folding until it was a tight square in his palm. He held it there for a moment, feeling the edges of it, before he dropped it in the trash can under the sink. This has been Fulfillment of the Law, a Havoc in Wyoming bonus story by Millie Copper, produced by CU Publishing LLC and presented by Killer Cozies. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to never miss a new story. Learn more about Millie Copper's books at milliecopper.com.
The end. We hope you've enjoyed this production of
Fulfillment of the Law, a Havoc in Wyoming short story, made with spoken.